Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for attending our first WEN Global event for the year. I want to acknowledge our corporate sponsors, Chevron, Deloitte, Ernst & Young, Williams, Woodside Energy, Baker Hughes, Siemens Energy, Capgemini, Protiviti, and Mitsubishi Power. And for this morning, I want to introduce our speakers, Jillian and Sophie. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us today on compensation negotiation. Jillian Climy is the co-founder of The Thoughtful Co. She has spent her career advising and leading teams in executive compensation and corporate governance, both as a consultant and in-house at two global retailers. Most recently at Lululemon, she led the global equity and executive compensation programs. And Jillian co-founded The Thoughtful Co. to leverage her niche and technical experience coupled with her passion for gender equity to empower women to get paid what they deserve. And Sophie Warwick is the co-founder of The Thoughtful Co. She specializes in developing in-house gender equity policies and chairing employee resource groups and advocacy groups. Sophie uses her data analysis expertise from her engineering background to define targets and track growth and retention. In 2018, she co-founded Women in Consulting Engineering, a nonprofit organization with over 500 members and monthly events to support and empower women in engineering. Sophie co-founded The Thoughtful Co. to build more gender-inclusive workplaces and a representation of women at senior levels at all industries. Because we have such an interesting topic today, I will save our announcements for another day. To that, welcome Jillian and Sophie.
Great, thank you so much for the introduction, and a big thank you to WEN for having us today. And welcome to Compensation Negotiation 101. We're really excited to present this topic to you. Now, I'll give a quick overview of how we're going to run the session so you know what's coming up. So we're going to start first with some welcome and introductions. So you can learn a little bit about Jillian, myself, and The Thoughtful Co. if you're not familiar with us already. Then we'll get into the presentation itself for about 35 minutes. And then we'll round out with some breakout rooms and then some Q&A at the end. So if you do have questions throughout the session, you're more than welcome to add them to the chat, but we're going to save the answers to the end, but we'll make sure that we're monitoring it so we don't miss any of those questions. Now, before I start the presentation, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that we are speaking to you today from the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I'm very grateful to be able to live, learn, and work on these lands. Now, at The Thoughtful Co., our mission is to enable recognition, opportunity, and influence for women in the workplace through individual and employer coaching. And we achieve this through two primary service offerings. So the first, which will be more the center of our conversation today, is we coach individuals, and specifically women, on negotiating for the compensation they deserve at key points in their career. So whether that's at a promotion, an interview, performance review, or any time you want to meaningfully have a conversation about compensation with your manager. Now, our other service offering is we advise employers on building more inclusive workplaces for women. So we focus our expertise on setting ambitious but realistic targets, and then assigning metrics to measure the progress towards those targets, as well as the efficacy of the individual program. So we want to know what we're recommending is really getting the positive change that we want. Now, if you do want to follow us along in the future, feel free to check out our LinkedIn at The Thoughtful Co. or our Instagram at thethoughtful.co. Now, I already had a wonderful introduction, but I wanted to share a little bit about why I do what I do at The Thoughtful Co. And at the start of my career, when I was working as a structural engineer, I was in a very male-dominated industry. And what I found for myself was I wasn't seeing myself reflected in senior leadership or other people within the industry. And sometimes I was seeking additional support, whether it was for mentorship or just lacking that sense of belonging. And I met so many incredible women throughout my career, but some of whom I was finding were leaving the firms they were at or the industries they were in entirely because they weren't finding the right environments to be most successful and were seeking those environments elsewhere. Now, on the other hand, through my nonprofit work, I worked with many sponsor companies that were really passionate about recruiting and retaining those same women, but they didn't always have the tools and resources to do so effectively. So ultimately, I was driven to co-found the Thoughtful Co. so that I could support more employers in more industries and more regions, building more inclusive workplaces for women.
My name is Jillian. I won't go through my whole bio since Regina did a great introduction, but a little bit about why I do what I do. I've spent my career in executive compensation at Aritzia, Lululemon, and other companies, which essentially means, helping boards or senior leaders determine how to pay their teams. And throughout that time, I had seen so many women, intelligent, successful, amazing women not negotiating their compensation at really key points in their career. And I always wanted to do something about that. So that really led me to co-found the Thoughtful Co. and love supporting women one-on-one and in workshops like today. So really excited to be here, and let's get into the content. So we always like to kick off these workshops with the concept of percentages versus dollars. And what I mean by that is compensation typically works in percentage increases, not dollar increases. So if I'm on a compensation team creating a recommendation for you for, let's say, a promotion, I will think about it as a 10% increase, not a $15,000 increase. And what that really means is every dollar that you give up now in negotiating has a multiplying impact in the future, because you're giving up all those percentage increases on that dollar over time. And that could be promotions, that could be new job offers, role changes, annual performance reviews, lots of different opportunities for those percentage increases. So it's just a good reminder as we kick off this presentation. We work with a lot of clients who have put off negotiating for months or maybe even years. But it's important to know that the earlier you do it, the better, because of those percentage increases. And even if you get just a little bit more, it can have a really big impact on your long-term wealth. And there's been studies around this. One large one out of the US found that a difference of $1,000 in your starting salary can mean a cumulative loss of over $500,000 in your career. And that is a bit of an older study. It's probably a higher number now. And especially for a group like this, who's in quite a specialized industry, that number is probably even higher. So even if you're not at your starting salary, it still holds true. The more senior you get in your career, those percentages typically equate to bigger dollars. So it's just a good reminder, getting even a little bit more can have a really big impact. And the earlier you negotiate, the better. All right, next we'll talk about the full compensation package. So the vast majority of our clients come to us and usually want to talk about base salary or their base pay rate. And that is totally valid because base salary helps us pay for our life and our expenses and our mortgages and all the things. But I don't want you to discount your bonus or equity compensation if applicable in negotiations. And when I say equity, I mean pieces like stock options, restricted stock units, performance stock units, etc. And why I don't want you to forget about these pieces is they can be more negotiable. So base salary often is constrained by a pay range. So there really is a maximum that you can hit in your negotiations, whereas bonus and equity is typically more flexible, especially in pieces like sign-on bonuses. So if you're going from one company to another, asking for a sign-on bonus to leave, an annual bonus that you're leaving behind at your last company, or to make up some of the difference in your negotiation. So really important pieces to be thinking about, especially as we get more senior in our career. Typically more and more of our compensation packages will be made up of these performance-based elements of pay. So the earlier you understand them and negotiate them, the better and the more impact they'll have on your long-term wealth. And a really big recommendation we have within all of this is do your due diligence on these programs. So often we'll see an offer letter with maybe 1 or 2 sentences on a bonus program or an equity program. And it's really hard to understand how they work based on those 2 sentences. So don't feel nervous to ask questions. Make sure you have that baseline understanding. In my previous life at Lululemon and other companies, if I had a candidate who didn't ask me any questions about the equity program, I probably would actually think they don't understand it very well. So know that asking questions is not a sign of weakness. It's actually a sign of strength in negotiations. And you can't negotiate something if you don't understand it well. So it's a great starting point to have. And then beyond bonus and equity, I also want you to be thinking about benefits and other key policies within the offer. These really can meaningfully impact your life and your enjoyment at work. That being said, they should not be trade-offs for taking a salary that's way too low, but are really important pieces to be thinking about if you're moving from one company to another, or even if you're looking at your current compensation package in your current company. So we've put a list on here just to get you thinking about some of these different pieces. The first one is health and dental benefits. If you're at, a bigger company or a government entity, typically these are pretty standardized and not negotiable. However, if you're at a smaller company or a startup or a private company, you might have what's called a healthcare spending account, and these actually can be negotiable in some situations. So especially if there's certain, prescription coverage that you need or whatever it might be, great one to be asking questions about, and know that these can sometimes be negotiable. Another big one that we've seen, really be more flexible over the past couple of years is PTO. There has been mass burnout in the workplace, as I'm sure a lot of us know, with the Great Resignation and everything that's been going on. And so employers are really starting to recognize how important PTO is, and they're being much more flexible in negotiations here. So if PTO is something that's important to you, it's actually a great time to be bringing it up, even if you're already in a company. Other pieces that are important to be thinking about are long-term saving plans. So things like 401k savings plans, parental leave policy, employee share purchase plan. Not the most exciting ones to read in offers, but they really can impact that long-term wealth. And oftentimes we'll see a client not really take them into account when they're evaluating an offer, whereas they actually can have really big financial impact. So definitely important ones to be looking at and making sure you're accounting for that when you're reading through your offer. Other pieces that are really important to be thinking about are allowances. So things like professional development allowances, coaching allowances, fitness allowances, technology and phone allowances are almost baseline now. Companies have been getting much more creative to really attract and retain talent through these past few years, and we're seeing these come much more common in offers. So great area to get creative around. If you're taking on your first manager level role, for example, maybe you want an executive coach to make sure you're showing up really well in that role, and see if you can get that covered for the first few months. Lots of ways where it's not a huge expense for the company, but really can have a big impact on your enjoyment and your success in your career. Another hot topic here that I won't go into too much is work from home days, remote work, flexibility. This definitely has been coming up a lot over the past few years. And the one recommendation we have here is it's always worth it to ask the question if this is something that's important to you, to see if there's more flexibility. Even with some employers where they seem to have really stringent policies, we're still seeing some individual flexibility to account for certain situations. So always great to ask the question to see what's possible. Next, again, not the most interesting topic, but is the legal terms in an offer. So things like non-competes, non-solicitation, severance. As you get more senior in your career, typically you'll start to see these being added in. And the big headline here is make sure you understand them. they actually really can have impact. And I think we're seeing, with some of the layoffs in tech, a lot of employees are starting to read these clauses more closely, which is great. You should be able to understand them. And if you're having a gut reaction to something that you feel something is really unfair or really doesn't make sense, it's probably correct. Know that these clauses are negotiable and really can impact you. So make sure you understand them and leverage advisors or support here if you need. And then lastly, role scope and title. This isn't the most obvious one when we're thinking about negotiating pay, but really compensation is so closely linked to role scope and vice versa. So if you're negotiating one, it's a good time to be negotiating the other as well. So maybe you really want to make sure you don't have any administrative duties in your role scope anymore. Once you're getting that promotion, bring that up. Really good time when you're talking about pay to also talk about role scope. All right, so switching gears a little bit, we'll now talk more about equity compensation. And the headline here is it's so important to be doing your research on equity if it's something that you might have at some point in the company that you're working at or at some point in your career. This will be applicable to some roles and maybe not others, but it's important to start thinking about it because it can have a big impact on your long-term wealth. So understanding the nuances of equity really is one of the greatest unlocks in negotiations if it's something that's available for you at your company. Equity compensation is more often negotiated and less standardized within companies, meaning there's more room for negotiation. And when we say equity compensation, the most common forms are typically stock options, restricted stock units, or performance stock units. And it's essentially giving you some sort of share ownership in the company, typically over a period of time. And we do have explainers on our website going through kind of the details of each of these units, if it is something that's applicable to you. And one stat here, throughout my career, anecdotally, I'd just seen not a lot of women negotiating their equity compensation. And I'd always wondered if it's contributing to the gender pay gap. And we did find a study to support this out of the US that found that male employees held an average of 105,000 in company shares, whereas women only held 26,000. So it's just a good motivator and reminder, if it is something that is offered at some point in your company, great time to be looking into it and ensuring you understand it. So one more page on equity compensation here. Really, in my view, one of the best ways to start negotiating your equity is by asking questions. As I mentioned, there's typically 1 or 2 sentences in an offer letter outlining equity compensation, and that is nowhere near enough information to be able to understand it well, how it impacts your long-term wealth, and how you can negotiate it. So I put a list here of some of the key pieces really to make sure you understand about your equity before you're signing on or before you're negotiating that offer. The first one here is types of units used. So at a high level, important to know if it's a stock option, a restricted stock unit, share appreciation right, etc. Each one of these units has a slightly different risk profile. And depending on your own personal risk profile, you might want to push more or less on that because of it. So really important to understand at a high level what that unit is. Next is vesting schedule. So typically equity is granted to you in 1 year, but does not become yours or does not pay out to you until multiple years down the road. And this is one area where we've definitely seen clients who thought they were getting something early on and then realized they weren't getting any payouts maybe until 3 or 4 years later. So really important to ask what the vesting schedule is so you can make sure you understand when you're getting those payouts, especially if you're not thinking about staying at a company for the long term. Another key one here is grant cadence. Are you getting that equity on an annual basis, or is it just a one-time grant? We've seen clients make this mistake as well, thinking they're getting it every year when really it's just a one-time award. Termination conditions is another really important piece. So what happens to your equity if you were to leave the company? what happens if you were to be terminated, what happens if you were to retire. Really important to understand these before you sign on, and they should be clearly laid out within the equity plan text, so completely valid to ask about. And then another key one within this is taxable events. Not the most exciting one, but if you are getting some sort of equity compensation, it's really important to know what kind of taxation is applicable and when those taxable events are, because in a lot of situations, employers don't have to withhold all the tax and you actually have to personally upfront some of it. So really important one to look into, leverage an accountant or another advisor here if you need. All right, now we'll talk a little bit about bias. And this one is a reason why Sophie and I do what we do and why we started the Thoughtful Co. Know that a negotiation will be biased, and that is because we are all biased. I am biased, Sophie is biased, everyone in this group is biased, your leaders are biased, and biases can help us do things more efficiently in the workplace and do things faster, but they also can really negatively impact certain groups. And one of those groups that we're talking about today is women in the workplace. And we think it's really important to be aware of some of these biases and think about how they may have impacted us in our career, even if we didn't realize it. So we'll go through a few of them today. So the first one we have up here is women expect and ask for lower compensation than men do. So know if you're really worried about asking for that additional $6,000, your male counterpart might be asking for $10,000. The likability bias impacts how women negotiate. And this bias is, on one hand, women are supposed to be nice and agreeable in the workplace, and that impacts how their performance is assessed. But on the other hand, women are supposed to be assertive in the workplace to be seen as a leader, and that impacts how they move up and they're promoted in the workplace. So we're constantly balancing these conflicting demands, which are pretty hard to balance already. And then when we throw negotiating into the mix, a lot of women just choose not to negotiate because they don't want to tip that balance too far, too aggressive or assertive. And this bias is probably the one that we see impacting most of our clients on the day-to-day, even if they haven't realized it. And it's fair, it's a tough one to be navigating in the workplace. And we'll talk a little bit on the next slide about how we can actually combat this bias. And as a lot of us know, the pandemic and what we've been through over the past couple of years has exacerbated some of these biases that women already face. So overall, this slide is not the most positive one to read, but we think it's really important to bring up, to be aware of, but also know that companies are starting to be more aware of these as well. Hopefully these facts and these pieces on this slide aren't completely new to you. And we are not in a place where we have amazing pay equity yet, and that's why the Thoughtful Co exists. But we're starting to move in that right direction, which is great. Also, I would say use these stats and these biases to motivate you. When I read that for every 100 men promoted to manager, only 86 women are promoted, that makes me want to go ask for my promotion right when I deserve it, not 6 or 12 months down the road after I've been stewing on it and thinking about it for a long time. And then lastly, know that negotiating doesn't need to be a big negative experience. You can actually negotiate in a really positive way and still be really clear and direct in what you want. And this is one of our favorite ways to support our clients, is helping them craft a negotiation script in a way that feels natural for them to say, and their confidence in saying it because it is positive, but still very clear and direct in their ask. And we always say, you know, negotiating often is inherently positive because you're asking for something because you want to stay at the company or you want to join that company, which is a positive thing. So why not frame it in that way? You can say, you know, I really love working on this team and I see myself growing with this company over the long term. And because of that, I wanted to be open with you about where I'm at from a compensation perspective. So right away, you framed it that you're bringing this up because you want to stay and grow with this team over the long term. And the vast majority of managers, that's exactly what they want to hear right now, because retention has been a big issue. So framing it in that way shows what's in it for your leader, for the company, which is always helpful to bring up. And then pairing that with a really clear and concise ask is super powerful. We often work with clients and they sometimes feel like they're the only ones negotiating and they're asking for too much and they're really nervous about it. But as someone who's spent her career working inside compensation teams, know that negotiations happen all the time. It's a very normal part of an employee-employer relationship. Your employer is doing the best they can to get the best out of that relationship, and you need to do the same as well. Also know this is a part of your manager's job. It's probably not their favorite part, but it is a part of it. And I in vast majority of cases, I'm sure your manager has been asked for more money before. You're not the only person doing it. All right, the next one here is knowing your non-negotiables and your risk reward profile. And the important piece here is really know exactly what you're asking for before you go into that negotiation. And this might seem like an obvious one, but I've been in a lot of situations where it's not clear what the person on the other side of the table wants. And in that moment, you know, the leader or the employer knows that they can move you where they want you to go. So give yourself the space and time to get really clear on what you're asking for. Dollar amounts, timelines, dates, titles, whatever those key pieces are, be very clear with yourself on them before you go into that conversation. We work so hard for our employers and add so much value, but we don't work that hard to make sure we're showing up really well in that conversation. So give yourself the space and time to feel good about what you're coming in with. You're never going to feel 100% confident. We never had one client feel 100% confident, but give yourself that time to do the research and prep so you really feel good. And we often get asked the question, should I ask for a specific number or a range? We are advocates for asking for a specific number because it shows you know exactly what you want, and it puts the onus on the employer to then respond to you. If you're giving a range, it shows you still can be moved and swayed, and it gives the employer more power. If you're super early in a recruiting process and you don't understand the role scope yet, and you haven't been given a lot of detail, fine to give a range at that point if you want. But in those later stages of a recruiting process, or if you're already in a company, we do recommend that specific number. And then also know how much lower risk but lower reward compensation you'll give up for higher risk but higher reward compensation. And what I mean by that is how much salary will you give up for bonus or profit share or equity or other performance-based components of pay. Very helpful to go through this with yourself in advance and figure out your own personal risk profile, because this can often come up real time in a negotiation. And if you thought through those scenarios, you're going to show up much more confidently. That being said, we always recommend, no matter what you're offered in a negotiation, even if it's millions of dollars, say, thanks, I'll take this away to review it. It's really hard to objectively evaluate an offer real time. There's lots of emotions flying around. There's typically different components of compensation. There's details that you'll need to review in an offer. So never feel pressure to accept or say yes real time, and give yourself that space so you can objectively review it. All right, next we'll talk about market data. So we often get the question, should I be going on Glassdoor or Fishbowl or other market data sources? And we are big advocates for being as prepared as possible. So I think it's great to leverage market data if you have it. I would caution that compensation has been changing so much over the past couple of years. Glassdoor and Fishbowl and these other sources are already self-identified, so they can be not the most reliable. Even if you have a really reliable market data source, it's hard to really replicate how fast compensation has changed, especially in certain industries. So I would always take it with a grain of salt. And I also want you to know that compensation decisions are made on many factors beyond just market data. And sometimes we do see an over-focus on market data in negotiations. So we've outlined a couple of the other factors here so you can be aware of and just have that more holistic view before you go into a negotiation. So the first one here is experience. How much experience do you have in the role? How much experience do you have in the industry? The second one is level. If you're a senior vice president or a manager, you'll likely be paid a little differently. The third one is time and role or time in the company. Some companies really care about this one. Other companies don't care about it as much. The fourth is talent pipeline. So are there 20 people who can do what you do in the company, or are you the only person that does it? You might be paid a little bit differently because of that. Individual performance is a really important one, and Sophie will touch on this in a few other slides, but one that we find is often under-focused on in negotiations, but can be the most impactful and important one. Location is another one. So if you're based in New York or Portland, you might be paid a little differently. And then importance of the function to the business strategy. And what we mean by this is each company should have a business strategy, hopefully. And within that, they should have their own compensation philosophy. And how this can really play out in practice is, for example, say I'm a software engineer at Microsoft. I might be paid a premium for that role because it's essential to Microsoft's business strategy. However, if I'm a software engineer at a bank, I might not be paid that same premium because it's not essential to their business strategy, but an investment banking director instead might be paid that premium. So different industries prioritize different roles, and even different companies within the same industry do prioritize different roles. So when we over-rely on market data, sometimes it's not taking into account all these other pieces that are at play when someone's determining your pay. So it's really helpful to have this more holistic view.
So now we get into articulating your unique skill set. So what is it about you that no one else can do? And sometimes when we work with our clients, we get those questions around, should I be bringing up those external factors? So Jill already touched on market data, for example. Another one that often comes up is, should I bring up inflation? So you might want to say, I would like a $10,000 raise this year because inflation was so high. And now, while that's absolutely true, it's really applicable to everyone in your role, company, and industry as well. So it's a much bigger lift in terms of getting that yes. And it's not really centered around what you're delivering. So when we talk about framing a negotiation, it's much more powerful and impactful to focus about on what you're bringing to the table. So start trying to build out a portfolio of your strengths. Now, I know we do lots of these things in interviews and performance reviews, but it's oftentimes something that we're doing right before that event. So try to make it something that you're building and adding to throughout the year, setting reminders to yourself to think about new projects that you're taking on and new experiences, and also reach out to your network to hear their feedback. Often when we create those strengths for ourselves, we're thinking about very role specific or technical experiences. But sometimes when we ask, say, our friends, family members, or colleagues, sometimes we get those key soft skills back. So maybe something about our leadership or our communication style that can be really impactful when we're thinking about our strengths and how we present to our team. And now when we get to actually articulating and communicating those strengths in a negotiation, we like to focus on just 2 to 3 key strengths. So you're not diluting the focus too much and they're really impactful. So being very selective on what you choose to include, and then communicating each of those as a 3-step approach. So the first being naming and identifying the strength. And then the second being showcasing that strength with a key example where you demonstrate it. So I might say, I'm very detail oriented, as demonstrated by my ability to send my reports directly to senior executives with my manager trusting they don't need to review that work. Now, the third step, which is often forgotten and is so impactful in compensation negotiations, is tying that strength to a key company metric. So you might be thinking about things like profitability, growth, new clients, or time savings. Now, as we're more senior in our career, or depending on what the nature of our role is, then we might be leading on more of those big ticket items like direct revenue contributions or new clients. But when we're more junior, or depending on maybe our role as more an individual contributor, those time saving ones can be really powerful as well. So in that example I just shared, I might add that time saving of me sending those reports directly to senior executives saved my manager 3 hours a week every week, which allowed her to launch 5 new products this year. So now my direct strength is really impacting company success as well, which is such a powerful way to communicate your value. And make sure you understand your power in that conversation as well. Your manager is seeking to retain you, or this new job offer is really looking to hire you. They've invested a lot of time, so they're wanting to come to something that feels good for both parties as well. So make sure that you understand this isn't just you asking for more. Everyone is seeking that outcome as well. Now, it's important to carve out time to practice. And now I know this sounds trivial, but sometimes we need to actually block out the time to make sure we can practice the way we want to communicate it. So you might have written this great script that you want to share of your key strengths, but if you haven't practiced the way you're going to deliver it, thinking about your body language, your word choice, making sure it's clear, short, and concise, so it's not distracting to the other person on the other side of the table, then we can lose a little bit of the power in that conversation. So make sure you carve out time to practice as well. It can be great to do something in front of a mirror where you can see that feedback as well. But it's also important to schedule a mock interview with a friend, family member, or coach who can give you that feedback on the way you're communicating and the way you're presenting. It's so helpful to have someone review that conversation and make sure they understand the message, if they have any feedback on the way you're delivering it. And all of that preparation will make you feel more confident because you feel comfortable in the way you're delivering that message. You know your key points and you're not getting lost in your words in an already nerve-wracking situation. So make sure you're taking that time to practice, even if it's blocking all of Sunday to take all day to practice. If that's what you need to do to feel good, make that happen. Now, another thing that we need to do in compensation negotiations, but arguably in all of our personal and professional lives, is taking time to feel good physically. So that can mean getting a good night's sleep, making sure we're not hungry when we're going into that conversation. Maybe it's going for a run before that meeting. Maybe that's the last thing you want to do. And instead, you want to make sure that you watch your favorite movie the night before, or have tea with a friend, or whatever it might be. When we're hungry and tired and distracted and stressed, it doesn't matter if we've done all the preparation, we have fantastic data, we've practiced so much, we're not going to be grounded and present in that conversation. So you want to make sure you feel good, which will help you feel focused. Compensation negotiations can be emotionally charged as well. And if you're feeling more grounded, you'll feel more pragmatic, more calm and comfortable. And that confidence will display to the person on the other side of the table as well. So it is really important to be intentional. So again, I love to use calendar blocks to make sure I have time to go to bed early the night before, or sleep in, or whatever it might be. Be intentional about making time to do those things. Another common challenge that comes up and has been more challenging in the virtual world is that temptation to book meetings back to back, and all of a sudden you're rushing out of one into a really important meeting and still thinking about that last conversation. So make sure you block time before and after to just be focused on that one conversation and not rushing in or out of that meeting. And lastly, I love to plan something fun to look forward to after. If I've done something difficult that's made me nervous, it's important to reward ourselves as well. So make sure you're doing that too. Now, we do recommend getting an advisor who can help you review the key terms from a market perspective and understand all of those different elements from your compensation package and how they're translating into your personal wealth as well. As we've spent this conversation discussing, there are so many different elements that go into your compensation, and you want to make sure you feel really good about those numbers. We've already seen a couple of questions come through in the chat about how to get good context and good market data, and it's really challenging, and it can be helpful to have someone identify any areas where it looks like there's gaps, where you might want to push on, and then how you might want to deliver that message as well. And all of that preparation and data will help you show up really powerfully. You'll know what important questions you want to ask about. You'll know how you want to frame that conversation, having a great script to bring into it. And all of that preparation and data will be really clear to that person that you're discussing it with, because you're asking really important and thoughtful questions, and it will show that you've prepared and set you up for a great negotiation. Now, we did want to share a couple of advisors that you might want to leverage based on your situation. So one is a compensation and negotiation advisor. That's something we provide at the Thoughtful Co, where you can do prep sessions to make sure you have an opportunity to review those key terms, as well as support in crafting a script that you can present to your manager. Another is an employment lawyer, which is really important to review the legal terms within a contract. There's a lot of different elements, and you want to make sure that you have the coverage to feel good about that. And then lastly, an accountant, understanding those tax events, especially if you are more senior in your career or there's an equity component as well. You want to make sure you can plan accordingly for those events. Now, lastly, we love to end on this one, to not let your compensation define you. Now, when I say this, I want to be very clear. This is not to justify asking for less than you deserve. You should always be compensated fairly for what you're delivering, but it's important to take that step back and remember that compensation is not the be all and end all, and you are so much more than a paycheck. We have a tendency to put compensation on that pedestal, and it makes it really difficult to talk about, and it also aggravates those nerves around negotiations, because the fear of that no becomes so great. But that small shift in perspective and understanding that compensation is just one element of your total value can be really helpful to make you feel more calm and comfortable going into negotiations and just talking about compensation in general, which will set you up for success and potentially give you the opportunity to get some great market data points real time. So always take that moment to remember that compensation doesn't define you. Now, before we get into the Q&A, we're going to send everyone into some breakout rooms, and we've prepared some questions as well, which I'll copy into the chat so you have those here, and then we'll wrap up in about 10 minutes to go into Q&A.
All right, welcome back.
Welcome back, everyone. We'll give everyone the last 20 seconds here to join from their breakout rooms, and then we'll get started on the questions. Great. Welcome back, everyone. So I think we've got everyone back now, and hopefully you enjoyed your breakout room. So we're going to kick off with the Q&A, and we've got a lot of fantastic questions that already came through in the chat. So we're going to start with those. And then for any time left over, feel free to keep adding into the chat or use the hand raise function. But to kick things off, we'll start with some organizations ask about salary expectations while applying. Does that have any impact on recruitment, and how to decide that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we help a lot of our clients, when they get asked that question, help to actually reframe it. Oftentimes when you're getting asked that question, it's really early in the recruiting process. And at that stage, you don't know a lot about the role or the company or the elements of compensation that they offer. So it's a great way to turn the question back on them. So you can say, I'd love to better understand the scope of this role, how it functions within the company, and the different elements of compensation and benefits that you offer. So before I understand that, I can't answer that question, but would love to hear from you what your salary range is. So you're really flipping it back on them. Because as someone who spent their career in compensation, I wouldn't be able to say what I wanted to make for a role until I thoroughly understood it and understand all the different elements of compensation within it. So it's a great way to say, I'm not able to answer that question yet based on the information that I have, but I would love to understand what your salary range is.
I love that. Yeah, turning that question back. There's another question that came up on equity compensation. I struggle with measuring the value of equity compared to base comp for comp increases. Is there a good rule of thumb for figuring out how to weigh whether preferences is equity or stock options or base comp without knowing where a company's valuation will ultimately land on those stock options?
It's a great question. We've never got this one before, and I love it. So I think it does depend if you're at a public or a private company. If you're at a public company, you can more easily value the stock options or the PSUs or the RSUs, so you can really understand the risk profile. At private companies, it's definitely harder to do that. So we see so many offers that come out that just say, we're giving you 1,000 stock options, for example. And that doesn't tell you anything about the value of them. 1,000 units, if you're at Google, that could be $1 million. If you're at a small startup, that could be $1,000. So really important to ask what the grant date value is. And they might not be able to tell you exactly what it is, given confidentiality reasons, but they should be able to give you a ballpark. How can you evaluate an offer if you don't have a ballpark of what the dollar amount is? Completely fair question to ask, and you can at least get the conversation started so you can understand approximately where that value is. And then you can evaluate, within your own personal risk profile, how much risk are you willing to take? Stock options are a riskier form of equity than restricted stock units, for example. So really starting to understand the fundamentals of those units and how they play into your own personal risk profile is helpful. We're always open to, offline, if you have any questions about equity compensation specifics, I love to talk about it. And between the mix of bonus, equity, and base salary, I always say when you're starting to get into those performance-based elements, have a minimum you'll take for salary that will cover you no matter what happens to the bonus or the equity. Unless you're in a position where you can take on a ton of risk, it's always great to have that non-negotiable salary that you go in with that will cover all your bases. You feel comfortable based on your value and your market worth, and then you can kind of negotiate bonus and equity from there.
I love that, getting a strong understanding of your non-negotiables and then your own risk reward profile as well. And then another question that came up on how do you ask about non-compete and severance during negotiations if they aren't mentioned? I love this question because it's so important, but it can feel uncomfortable to negotiate your exit at the entrance.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So if there's no non-compete or non-solicitation in an offer, that's great news because it says you're not being restricted on where you can go after you leave the company and if you want to take anyone with you. So if there's no non-compete or non-solicitation, I would not ask about it because you don't want to get those terms added in. The only downside is if there's no severance, that means if you're terminated, you just get the minimum under your state's act. So that might be a couple weeks of salary, or if you're at a more executive role, or if you've been at a company for a while, it might be a few months. But so it's an interesting one because as you get more senior in your career, you should be able to negotiate more severance because you have a highly specialized role the more senior you get. But if you don't have a non-compete, it's also really helpful because you can go wherever you want after a company. And typically they're brought up together. So overall, if you're reading nothing in your contract about a non-compete, non-solicitation, or severance, that's great news. And I would just evaluate if it's worth it to negotiate for that severance, knowing they may put in place a non-compete with it. If you do have certain pieces, say you just have a non-compete or non-solicitation, it is great grounds to be negotiating that severance. So overall, severance is more positive, non-competes and non-solicitations are more negative to you. So it kind of depends what shows up in that offer, and then figuring out how you want to negotiate it from there.
Yeah, I love that. And on negotiations as well, do you have any templates you use for figuring out what you're going to say in the negotiation?
Yeah, that's a great question. We actually, we support a lot of our clients in our one-on-one coaching with coming up with a negotiation script, which sounds funny, but is actually so helpful. We've used it with senior execs to new university grads, just to kind of compile your thoughts into something that's really concise and helpful. You can memorize the script and then go into the negotiation. And if you're not looking for one-on-one support, we do have the script in our store on our website, so you can just purchase that. But overall, I would say it's really helpful in general to lay out your thoughts in advance and feel really comfortable with the flow of what you're saying. As women, unfortunately, you know, how we say things can sometimes be as important as what we say, given we're judged more harshly. So it's really important to really craft that script and figure out how you're going to say things in advance.
I love that. Yeah, taking that time for the preparation. And I'll add the link to the negotiation script in the chat as well if anyone's interested. We have another question here. Why are you and Sophie referencing dollar amounts when the first slide emphasizes percentages?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the percentages is more from the compensation HR perspective. So that's how an HR team will think about it. They will look at your pay and say, let's give them a 10% increase. Rarely will they say, let's give them a $5,000 increase. But typically when you're negotiating and you're referencing your own pay, you can say it in dollar amounts. It doesn't need to be in the same language as theirs. Typically you would want to negotiate for $100,000 or whatever it might be. So that's kind of why we've been doing both throughout the slides.
In your experience working on compensation teams, can you give examples on what are hard no's or expectations an employer typically just won't budge on?
This is a really good question. I've also never been asked this before. I mean, it's very dependent. There's some companies that don't negotiate, which is rare, but they set, you know, our salary ranges are what they are, our offers are what they are, no negotiation. I would say the vast majority do have flexibility within negotiations, even more structured environments like government and sometimes unions. So always worth it to ask. A lot of companies in the private sector will have a certain bonus percentage and certain equity grant for level. So that's where I'll see kind of a hard no. If you might negotiate, say you're getting a 10% annual bonus and you try to negotiate a 15%, it might be a hard no because everyone at that level has the 10%. So I can see some kind of hard no's there. Let me think what else. Relocations sometimes have really stringent policies that you can't really push too much on. So how many months will they cover you at a new place? How much expenditure will they cover you to move? I see hard no's there sometimes, but I mean, in general, most things, there's exceptions and there's flexibility. Even when HR teams try to really create a lot of structure, negotiations and hiring employees is often really personal for a leader or a manager. They put a lot of time into the process, so they want to do what they can to get that employee. So if there's anything we could leave you with today, things are much more negotiable and flexible often than employees think. So it's always worth it to ask if there's something that's important to you.
I love that. And another one that came up is education a factor in determining compensation?
Yes, yeah. So I kind of lump that one into experience, but definitely, especially on certain technical roles, education can be super impactful.
And then we have another question here. Do you have any tips for asking for a higher salary in a company that doesn't have salary transparency? Post-COVID, I've seen new hires get hired on with higher starting salaries than new hires in previous years. Does that mean that those who have been there longer also have basis for arguing for a raise? Yes, we sometimes call this the loyalty tax.
Yeah, so we saw this a lot throughout the pandemic. When there was the economy was crazy positive and hiring and retaining employees was really tough. New offers were coming out so much higher than current employee pay. And that was called the loyalty tax. You're almost paying a tax for staying at your current employer. A lot of employers have realized this and are starting to kind of course correct where we were, which is great. I would say if you're already in a company and there's no salary transparency, really framing the ask around you and the value that you add. So what are those key metrics that you've contributed to this year? How have you directly supported your leader or your team? Bringing up revenue, clients, some of those things we brought up earlier. 3 key points on how you've directly supported the company and the team. It shows, again, your leader, what's in it for them. It shows what they would lose if they lost you. And it's really impactful in a non-structured environment when there might be more flexibility within salary negotiations.
Yeah, I think that's great, and definitely a very strange and unpredictable time in the last few months and few years. We have another question here on market data. So can you share some good resources for researching market data beyond Glassdoor and Fishbowl, government sites, or any others that you might recommend?
Yeah, this is a good question, and we often get asked this, and it's really hard to find good market data. And I would actually say some of the best ways I would recommend is going on LinkedIn and searching for similar roles in your state or wherever you're based, and looking at publicly disclosed salary ranges within that can be really helpful. That's real-time data. That's why I'm, instead of leveraging kind of market surveys, looking at that real-time posting. Another way to get real-time data is leveraging your network. So groups like this are amazing, facilitating women coming together in similar industry and roles. Gently asking people, is anyone comfortable sharing information? Again, that's real-time data that's really helpful. We haven't found, an amazing market data source that I can point you to that hasn't gotten old really quickly. So that's why both of those pieces are those real-time data pieces. We also support with this within the clients that we've worked with. We built our own market data, which again is more real-time in the past year. So if you're looking for kind of that more granular support, we can support with that. But otherwise, talking to people and LinkedIn are some of the best ways that we found to get relevant data.
Yes, such a good plug for getting comfortable talking about compensation with your network as well. We have another question here. At my company, and probably most companies, engineers earn more than non-engineers. So an engineer without a graduate degree earns more than non-engineers with a graduate degree. Seems like a graduate degree should level the field, but it does not in this case. Do you have suggestions on how to bridge this gap for non-engineers?
This is another great one that I've never been asked before. I love all these questions. So that's an interesting one, kind of how I talked about compensation philosophy in different industries, prioritizing different roles in different companies. Education is one factor that goes into the mix of compensation decisions and how people arrive at your pay. Certain roles it's prioritized more than other roles. So I would say, in your case, really building that case on why your education is valuable and how it's directly adding value to the company or the team or the department that you're in can be really helpful. So what key metrics is it supporting you and helping you build on? How is it unique, and how does it give you a unique skill set that's adding value to the company? So really kind of, again, that what's in it for the company, what's in it for your leader. But I know that can be frustrating, and it's really just around, prioritization of those different kind of pieces that we talked about in different industries.
We had another question come here. I'm just going to combine 2 questions that are a little bit similar around relocation. So what are things you should include or consider when negotiating a relocation package? And then what is a typical relocation package?
Yeah, that's a great one. So they definitely vary based on level. So depending how senior you are in your career. but typically what you can think about is someone to coverage of movement of some of your items to a new place. You can also think about, or either an allowance to purchase if you're not moving things, to purchase items in the new place. You can think about your flights covered, your meals covered while you travel. You can think about getting, usually 1 to 2 months of housing covered if it's a major move. So you have time to find a new place. Sometimes companies will cover setting you up with some sort of personal agent in the new place to help you figure out what neighborhoods to move to, all those types of pieces. At an executive level, you can start to think about coverage of your family moving, coverage of finding schools for your kids. It can get much more granular if there's specific things that you want moved over. Sometimes that happens. Tax equalization as well. I won't get too much into that, but if you're really changing, if you're moving from state to state and the tax is significantly changing, make sure you think about that within your relocation. Do you need any kind of equalization there? Cost of living, another area where there might be equalization. So it can get pretty granular based on your level. But again, some companies have really stringent policies where it kind of just is what it is. Some are a bit more negotiable. Always worth it to ask if there's some, unexpected expense that's coming up, especially if you're, if it's completely what the company wants, worth it to ask in those situations for sure.
I love that. Yeah, I think always just worth it to ask and then create that kind of map for yourself of what those changes are. And so we're getting close to the end of the time here, and we've still got time for another question here. But before I get to that question, I wanted to share a discount code that we're going to share with Wen. So we've got it up on the slide, and I'm going to add it to the chat as well. And I know there's been so many wonderful questions throughout the session. So if we're not able to get to all of them, we're going to share our contact information as well, so that you can please reach out to us. You can obviously tell we're very passionate about talking about compensation. So happy to answer any questions that we haven't got to yet. So the next question we have here is a question that was raised in our breakout room is how much percentage increase should be asked and how to understand the range?
Yeah, this is another tough one. There's definitely, there's some general kind of guidance I can give you. If you're thinking about an annual performance review, typically in a normal year, which we haven't really been in with inflation and COVID and all the things that have been happening, but in a typical normal year, there's usually, about 3 to 3.5% budgeted per employee for an annual performance increase. That is in general. Some companies do much higher. Some more structured companies have 1 to 2%. I would say around the 3% is a good gut check. For promotions, another general percentage I can give you is a 10 to 15% promotion. That's in general what I see. Again, there's specifically, depending on your role, if your current compensation makes sense, it is so individualized. So those are some general gut checks that I can give you. But really what I would say, is so many of us know what we should be getting paid. So many of our clients come to us, have a number in mind. We often push them a little bit more on that number because they're lowballing themselves a little bit. And they kind of know that gut reaction to that number. So if there's something that you feel you should be making, it's probably right. And if you do want one-on-one support, we're always around, but following your gut and advocating for yourself is probably the main takeaway from this presentation. So those are some general percentages, but again, it is so individualized.
Love that. Perfect one to end on, to remember to advocate for yourself and your value. And on behalf of Wen, we wanted to say a big thank you to everyone for being here today. We also wanted to thank Wen for bringing us in. We loved being here today. Such fantastic questions, and actually quite a few that we haven't got before. So that was really wonderful to see. And again, if we didn't get a chance to get to yours, please get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you so much to Regina and Wen for having us here today. Those were incredible questions. I think some of the best I've ever gotten. And yeah, please reach out if you have any others. You can add us on LinkedIn. We love to chat about this, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.